So as men move into their careers, how might responsibility and purpose be conceptualized? Well, look, so I always start from the fundamental observation that life is characterized by a fair bit of suffering. There's a tragic element to life. Tragedy tainted by malevolence. And what that poses a problem, and the problem is, well, what can sustain you through suffering and tragedy, betrayal and illness, death, loss, disappointment, frustration, confusion. And it's not hedonism. It's not happiness. Not if you conceptualize happiness in this narrowly pleasure-seeking hedonic way. First of all, that doesn't iterate very well. You know, you can drink a 26 of vodka one night, and that might be a pretty fun night, but you know the next 2 or 3 days are not going to be so pleasant, and you'll probably do at least 5 things that you seriously regret, assuming you can remember what they are. So it's not a great strategy, and everyone knows that you know, that casual, impulsive pleasure-seeking is not, it's not a good game. Everyone knows that. And that doesn't mean you should be afraid to try it, right? That's entirely different. You need to bash yourself around a bit. What did William Blake say? Wisdom through excess. There's definitely something to that. So, you know, walling yourself away from experimentation, that's not a good idea. But falling prey to indulgences, that's a catastrophe. So you can't find, and then if your life is proceeding in a direction that's painful and tragic for reasons that might be really out of your control, obviously you're not going to be happy during those times. You may not have even the opportunity to seek anything that's pleasurable or the ability to experience it. So then what's going to sustain you under those circumstances and sustain your will to live, but even more importantly, protect you from the resentment and the moral corruption that unrequited suffering can so easily produce? And the answer to that is not happiness, but something like meaning. And then you might ask yourself, well, where is meaning to be found? And the answer seems to be primarily through the voluntary adoption of responsibility. You know, so people find meaning in the love they have for their partner and their decision to care for someone else as well or better than they would care for themselves. They find meaning in that, and it can sustain itself across many, many decades, for better or for worse. That's no joke, that phrase. They find meaning in the relationship they establish with their children, assuming they take the responsibility for that relationship. They find meaning in their friendships. They find meaning in their business associations, their civic engagement. You know, people moralize at older people, moralize at younger people and say, well, you should accept your responsibility. You should shoulder your duty. And that's true, but it isn't exactly that you should do it because you should do it, even though you should. It's that there isn't anything better that you can possibly do. Like, you have to justify yourself to yourself. You have to justify yourself to yourself because of your inadequacies and your failure and your error and your propensity to repeat errors that you know you shouldn't repeat, your sinful nature. You have to atone for that. And then you have to justify your life to yourself because it's characterized by death and suffering. And so you need something worthwhile to do. And, well, then you might say, well, there's nothing worthwhile to do. It's, well, you're probably not really in any position to make that judgment, you know, till you've gone all in at least one thing. At least one thing. Because, like, who the hell are you? You're 16, you're cynical and nihilistic. It's like, you're not wise. You're not a philosopher. You don't know anything. And thank God, right? Because you don't even want to think you know anything because you're bloody miserable and you're suffering. And so if you're also right, well, then you're doomed. So you better bloody well pray that your cynicism and nihilism, unearned though it may be, is based on a fundamental falsehood. And it is. You can find deep significance in your life, and you find it essentially through the decision to voluntarily bear your suffering and to trudge uphill nonetheless. And there's something heroic about that in the most fundamental sense. And that heroism is something so deeply meaningful that it, in some sense, triumphs over even death. And so As you move forward through life, you mature, you start by developing responsibility for yourself, your friends, your roommates, then you take on a partner, and you have a family, and you expand the domain of responsibility and generosity, and you want to expand that. Who knows how much you can expand that? You could be a credit to the nation. Well, there's an aim. Why don't you aim to be like credit to the nation by the time you're 50? Because what you got something better to do than that? And the answer to that's no. And what are you going to do? You're going to pursue endless one night stands. You're going to bury yourself nose deep in cocaine. You're going to become an alcoholic. You're going to pursue that tinsely, trashy hedonism that is nothing but destructive and generates nothing but self-contempt, and then bitterness, then misery, then vengefulness. It's like, that's why do that? I mean, it's easier in some sense, right? Although it's not, because it's rife with catastrophe and suffering. So it's way better to envision yourself as, that's the cross image fundamentally, right? The pathway to redemption is to bear your cross up the hill voluntarily. It's a hell of a thing to ask, right? Because you have to accept the fundamental limits of your mortal vulnerability. And you have to say to yourself, I will do good nonetheless. Right? And that's not obedience. That's not naivete. That's a cold decision, man. So everyone great makes that decision. So make that decision, because maybe you're great, despite what people tell you. The sacrifice that women make, especially in relationship to infants, is pretty obvious and should be celebrated, which is why the image of the Divine Mother and the infant is a sacred image. And any society that doesn't hold that as sacred is off the rails in some fundamental manner, regardless of what anyone says. And that's not merely a Christian image by any stretch of the imagination. The Egyptians had images of Isis with Horus on her lap that are clear prefigurations of the images of Mary and Christ. Of course, this society has to worship the mother and the infant because, well, obviously, if you can't see that, or if you don't want to accept that, I don't know what you're rebelling against, but it's certainly the spirit of life itself. So that's not going to work out well for you or anyone that is around you. Mothers, they need to trust. You need to trust your husband. And that's a hard thing to ask when you're trying to trust him in relationship to your kids, because your fundamental instinct is going to be to protect your kids. But that's not the only instinct you should manifest, because you also have to nurture their development as well as protect them. And so that's a competing force. And you might say, well, why should I trust a man? Of course, a man could say that about a woman too, but the woman could say, well, why should I trust a man, especially when I have vulnerable children? And the answer is, because you're courageous. Because that's the best thing to teach your children, that courageous trust. And because if you manifest that courageous trust, you have the best chance of calling out the corresponding behavior from your husband. And so it's not a matter of naivety. It's not a matter of ignorance. It's not a matter of willful blindness or of wishful thinking. It's a matter of courage. It's like, here, you take the baby. And then the woman has to let that happen, and have the confidence to allow the father to do the things he's going to do, to engage in rough and tumble play, to set boundaries, to encourage, but also within bounds. Paradise is a walled garden. So you could think that the woman, in some sense, tends the garden, but the man, he puts up the walls and makes sure that they're patrolled and that the walls are also limits for the children. And you don't get paradise without the walls. And hopefully you can do that with your wife in the spirit of play. And then you know your household is functioning properly to the degree that the spirit of play governs, rules. Then that's a sign that the negotiation has proceeded properly and that the children are in the garden playing like they should. It's incumbent upon mothers to find it in their realm of courage. And that's part of that myth of facing the beast. Of course, you're offering your child to a beast. But the way to tame him is to seduce him with the child. And that's risky, man. But hey, it's not as risky as not doing it. So that's the thing, is that there's no risk pathways. There's just your choice of poison. I've seen lots of mothers, I saw this all the time when we had little kids. The father would start to interact with the child and the mother would interfere, like right now. She just shut him down. And because she didn't trust him fundamentally, because she was cowardly fundamentally, and maybe she had reason not to trust him because, people aren't 100% trustworthy. But I saw this in some families, she'd shut the father down 50 times and he'd just stop interacting with the kids because, well, for obvious reasons. One thing you want to know in a marriage is do not punish behavior you wish to see repeated. And husbands do this to their wives a lot too, especially if they're the jealous type. So imagine you have a wife that maybe you got lucky and you attracted someone who's a little bit above your caliber, or at least that's what you think. And maybe you're right too, And so she's attractive and you're happy about that in some ways, but what about those other men? And so you go out one night and she dresses up and she looks pretty damn sharp and you're a little unhappy about that because, what about those other men? And so she asks you how she looks and you take that opportunity to punish her for her beauty. You do that 100 times. And you watch what happens. You think, God, you've let yourself go. It's like, no, I pretty much shaped myself into what you allowed. And people do that in marriages to each other all the time. It's a brutal. If you have a dog and you whack it on the nose when it approaches the bowl, it will starve to death. So punishment, judiciously placed punishment can be devastating. And the most devastating form of punishment is punishment for virtue. Like if I punish you because you misbehave, there's a huge part of you that's like super relieved about that. Hey, it's like, oh, thank God. Children feel this way all the time. Oh, thank God I didn't get away with it, So that's hardly a punishment at all. It's just justice. And that's a relief, to have justice prevail. That's the whole motif of Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky's novel. And but if you see someone do something good, like maybe your wife took a risk, she really got dressed up, she looks hot, and she took a risk. And so she's self-conscious about it. And you see that, and because you're jealous, you see just the right moment to slide in the knife. Man, you just blow people out of the water doing that. And you do that if you're resentful. And that's a really bad thing to do. You want to watch your partner and the people around you that you love. And whenever they do something that you would like to see more of, this is a great strategy and it's not manipulative. You got to have some sense of what you would like your family life to be like, your friends, everyone around you. When they do something that you would like to see more of, so you have to be smart enough to know what that is, you want to notice, nod maybe, a glance, or maybe you want to say, I used to do this with my kids all the time when they did something particularly well. I'd say, hey, here's what you just did. Detailed description. That was dead on. And that specificity, that's unbelievably rewarding because everyone sneaks out their best. They're afraid because people are afraid that they'll show their best and then it'll get rejected. And that really hurts. And so people sort of open the door and they kind of show you their best like that, just a little glimpse. And they're afraid, and then no one notices, and they think, yeah, well, nobody noticed, and then they fold up again. But if you see that and you notice and you say, hey, ha, caught ya, that was great, then they think, oh, wow, I thought maybe that was great. And so I used to teach a fourth-year seminar class, and I learned over some years to have the students, the first essay they had to write was 4 pages, and the next was 6, and the next was 8, but I had them rewrite the same essay. Because if you ever do a serious piece of writing, it goes through multiple iterations, and I wanted them to graduate from that class with having completed one serious essay, hopefully the best thing they ever wrote. And the first essay, like 80% of them they're just bloody dismal. Careless word choice, bad phrasing, sentences that were jumbled and incoherent, paragraphs that made no sense, all culminating to something formulaic and pointless, bad at every level of analysis. And my grading rule was the first essay is worth 5%, but I'm going to slaughter you. And so they could take that because it really didn't have much of an impact on their final grade, and I could be harsh without intimidating them too much. But one of the things I always looked for was generally, even in a really bad essay, there would be 1 or 2 sentences that were good, where the person actually came out of their possession and their persona and wrote something they actually thought. And the sentence would just sort of gleam, and I'd circle that and say, check. More of this. And then the next essay would be like 40% like that. And the next one, depending on how much they worked, 80 to 100%, identifying that what someone does right. This is a great thing to know. This will get you lots of places in your life. You watch people like a hawk, and when they do something good, you don't want to be presumptuous about this, right? You have to be careful when you compliment people. You generally can't compliment people who are way above you in a status hierarchy, for example, because it's presumptuous. But peers, for sure. People you love, generally. Certainly people who are lower in the authority hierarchy than you. But if you can single out something they did, if you're alert to that and you start fostering that around you, people just start doing more and more of it. And then you're just surrounded by that all the time. And that's so, like, how would you want anything better than that? So your primary job is to protect your wife from exhaustion, because taking care of an infant is exhausting, physically exhausting. So you need to pay attention to her, spell her off, and then get to know the child, at your own pace, but get to know the child. You'll see right away, if you spend some time with the child, if you're not afraid, that the personality of that person is already there. It's way in the distance in some sense, because there's only so much an infant can do, but the person's already there. And this is going to be a person you'll know for the rest of your life. And so you want to get to know this little person. And in doing so, you also differentiate that infant from infants. You might be, and this is typical of many men, they're just not that interested in babies. This isn't a baby. This is your daughter. That's a very specific thing. And that's a person, a specific person. And as soon as you establish a relationship with her, it's not just any old generic baby. And that can happen very early. So you want to protect your wife from exhaustion. And you want to establish a relationship with the child. You have to spend some time to do that. And then I would also say, your wife is going to be surfeited to some degree with physical contact. And so you're going to lose some degree of intimacy with her, particularly for the first 9 months. And so you have to get some of that attention from the baby, and that's a good thing to figure out how to do, because you lose on the one hand, but you gain on the other. It's also something you can teach siblings, that they'll lose their mother a bit, they'll lose their father, but they'll gain the attention from the baby if they're good at it, and you can teach them that. But I would also say, negotiate with your wife so that you two have some time for each other, even during that initial period of infancy, maybe less frequently, but some. And then make sure that you negotiate that on an ongoing basis going forward in your marriage. It's really easy for the intimate part of your marriage, the sexual part, to drop to priority 12 on a list of priorities of which you only ever address the top 5. So it's not like it's not important, but it falls far enough down so that it gets ignored. And that's a very bad long-term strategy. You have to, especially once you are married and you have children, you have to consciously attend to the maintenance of romantic intimacy. My observation was with couples that they needed to spend a minimum of 90 minutes a week talking with each other about the domestic economy, about the goings on in the household, to update each other about what was happening in their lives, in their mutual lives, but also to talk about the kids and the finances and the running of the household. You need 90 minutes. It's just a business meeting in some sense. And then you need at least one period of 90 minutes, but preferably 2 to 3, where you have a date. And so that's a reason, for example, when you have a 2-year-old, is when should the 2-year-old go to bed? Well, how about early enough so you have some time with your wife? So not 10 or 11 or whenever he falls over in an unconscious heap. How about like 7:30? Because then you get to have a life, and you should never, assuming you're reasonably mature and you can talk this over with your wife or your husband, you should never sacrifice yourself to your children to the point where you resent them. And you think, well, I wouldn't do that. I'd never resent my children. It's like, come on. That's like the most common thing in the world, for parents to resent their children and children to resent their parents and sisters to resent their brothers. It's like, don't be thinking that doesn't characterize you. And so you got to put up those limits. How much time do I want to spend with my child? And how much time do I want to spend with my wife? And that's a serious deliberation. And if you get it right, then you have it right. And if you get it wrong, well, that's the rest of your life. So, and then the last thing two last things I guess I would tell young parents: don't let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. And you can jointly agree on that, because if you dislike them, other people will. And your job is to maximize the social attractiveness of your children. Period. That's your job. Well, that would interfere with their creative development. It's like, yeah, no. They need friends. And they need to act well enough so that adults will smile when they're around and interact with them positively without lying. So when you have a child, you have the opportunity to grow up, right? To be a good parent, to be a mature father. But you also have the opportunity to establish a lifelong relationship that could be the best relationship that you ever had, that you ever have. And that opportunity, it's there. It's there for the taking. So it's certainly what the child would want and need. So whatever the responsibility is, that's such a great gift. It's certainly the case that I never regretted having children for a second. I had one very ill child too, and that was very hard. But whatever children take, they give back in spades. So, and if you can't see that, then you need to take the scales from your eyes.